All right, hello, Honors 100. Hope everyone's doing well. To start off today, we have two main objectives today. One, we're going to go through the two reading assignments I gave you for this time, and then I'm going to talk more about the workshop process we're about to go into in this class, the initial research integration assignment, and what the next steps are going to be following that. Because the mode in which we do class is going to shift for the next few weeks following today's class. So, Richard, I'm going to get into all of that in the latter part of this video. But the first thing I wanted to go to was the readings for today. And so obviously the two of them focus on Andre the Giant. And one of the interesting things to me is, as time passes on, we talked about this a little bit earlier in the class when we were addressing the Chuck Klosterman essay, This is Emo, where pop culture kind of touchstones change, right? Where, my parents kind of refer to people who were famous when they were teenagers and whatnot, and a few of them survive. Yeah, some of the big musical acts, some of the, greatest athletes of all time, those names might live on, but a lot of them don't live on so much, right? Like I never really got into the same TV shows that my parents were into when they were, in their, teenage years or 20s or whatnot, much the same way that I expect a lot of the stuff that I consider to be kind of, foundational in terms of, TV and movie and sports and music and all these different kind of parts of pop culture might not resonate, with all of you in quite the same way. So I'm curious, this is a really simple question, but to start us off, just how many of you were familiar with Andre the Giant before you read this? I know I feel like it often is kind of a balance of students where some have just really had never heard of the guy. Some had heard of him but didn't have a clear sense of really who he was, just knew that they'd seen him in sort of memes and things like that. So people have seen the Princess Bride movie that he acted in, that our readings reference very briefly. And some people might be wrestling fans, and if you're a wrestling fan who studied kind of your history at all, surely Andre the Giant has come up. But it's certainly possible to have missed him at this point. But he was, a very large man. He had disorder is probably not quite the right word, but he had, a situation with his body where he grew to, larger than kind of the typical human being. Now we know more about this sort of thing. I always want to say the disorder, but I always mispronounce it, so I'm going to leave it be there. But nonetheless, now there are treatments that would probably rein in his rapid growth and probably would have prolonged his life significantly. But as it stands, he had a relatively short life, but it was a larger than life, right, where he does live on to some extent. So in any event, I wanted to as kind of another open-ended big question before we get to the text themselves, just kind of pose, if there are mythic figures in your world, like people who you kind of talk about with reverence, who you almost can't believe are real people, or you kind of imagine, kind of put on a pedestal, the way that these writers seem to talk about Andre the Giant, and to be more transparent, the way that someone of my generation or earlier, a generation before might have looked at this kind of, enormous human being, seemingly capable of kind of superhuman things in terms of strength, in terms of how much he could drink, in terms of other odds and ends of what he could do. So to go more specifically though into the readings here, we'll start with the Schumacher essay here about Andre the Giant. And so there's this first paragraph of the essay. I'll just go ahead and read this one aloud. When Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant met in what is still considered the biggest wrestling match of all time, exaggeration was in the air. According to various contemporary reports, there were 95,000 people on hand at WrestleMania 3 to see the 7'5", 525-pound Andre square off against Hulk Hogan, who stood 6'8" and weighed 320 pounds, whose biceps measured 24 inches around. Probably the only number in that last sentence that's unimpeachable is the 3. No trick questions here, but the first question I want to ask is this word unimpeachable. What does that mean, and kind of what is Schumacher talking about here when he says that's the only number that's unimpeachable? Because I think that we can clearly kind of put together pieces. Some of those numbers there don't seem quite right. Right, we don't know for a fact that they're wrong, but they seem they could be exaggerated. Like a 24-inch bicep, someone who's extremely muscular, I'm still skeptical that the 24 inches, right? I think it's happened. I think it's possible, but man, that's an enormous arm, right? To be 2 feet around like that. And I'm curious why we start here. What this says about Andre the Giant as sort of a figure, that these numbers might have been inflated. Because there's no question he was huge, right? I don't know his actual exact measurements. I know they fluctuated over time, especially in terms of weight, but also in terms of height. These aren't sort of, drastic exaggerations as if I were to tell you I'm 7 feet tall and have, 20-inch biceps. Those would be just ridiculous exaggerations for me. But rather just kind of rounding up some in those cases. But what this says about Andre, that we'd have these sort of blown up numbers, and what it says about the spectacle of professional wrestling, right? Why would they sort of give these sort of exaggerated, inflated numbers, and yet ones that some people might believe are true. And again, I don't know for a fact that they're not, but they certainly seem a little bit exaggerated here. And then carrying on, just one other place I wanted to go here. There's this kind of fun concept here that Schumacher brings in on page 158 here, where he references the fact that Andre the Giant wouldn't be a champion very often, right? And for those who have no acclimation whatsoever to the professional wrestling world, now you have a little bit from having done the reading for today. But it's not real combat. Right. I hesitate to use the word fake because these guys do often take, real hits and real falls and things like that. And I shouldn't even say guys, there are plenty of women who do this as well. But these people involved in this, do take real physical punishment. Some of the stuff is obviously, more faked, right? Like, I mean, there's millions, if you want to look out at them, videos of, botches and glitches and, times when people, swing a punch and it clearly does not come within 6 inches of someone and they still act like they were hit. So this stuff exists. I'm not trying to, get rid of all that. But nonetheless, it's a form of sort of staged combat, right? Where they know who is supposed to win. They have some general game plan and or are coordinating on the fly to tell each other what to do, to make a plan and cooperate, not to actually fight one another. But it talks here about how Andre couldn't be placed as a champion. And they call him a division killer. And so again, not a trick question. I think it's more or less in the text or reasonable to intuit from what we have here. I'm curious. Excuse me. Excuse me, a couple sneezes here. This is unedited, so you just got the live action of my sneezes there. To carry on, though, this idea of Andre as a division killer and why that wouldn't make sense to make him a champion, how we make sense of that, what that means to us, if we can unpack those ideas a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to leave the Schumacher there. There's obviously more we could unpack, but I think I've said enough on that. So please feel free to address the questions or the points I've taken you to, but also feel free to bring in your own observations. Then I want to go to the Todd Kaneko poem here, the Selected Legends of Andre the Giant. And so we have these numbered legends here. And so I'm curious, first off, what we make of the numbering. First of all, it's a choice to structure it this way, just to have numbers at all. But secondarily, they leave a lot of open spaces, right? We start with number 13, we jump to 24, we go to 32, and onward from there. There's not a pattern in how we jump that sort of implies that there's some sort of structural element, that there's not sort of hints at what the missing ones might be. And in fact, I'll go so far as to say I don't think the other ones exist, right? I'm sure that there are other myths, but I also don't think that these are necessarily myths that anyone literally believes, at least for the most part. There are pieces here that perhaps you could accept as true, but most of it feels, again, pretty exaggerated. But what we make of this numbered kind of concept, and again, the fact that we don't have all of the numbers, why we think Kaneko chose to do it this way. And then I want to look specifically at the first one, number 13. After the dinosaurs fell asleep, after those terrible lizards began their slow decay into mythology, Andre the Giant was there to cradle their bodies in his soft hands and weep. And I'll go ahead and give my interpretation here, though I think that you could expand upon this. But this idea that a figure like Andre the Giant is timeless, like he's always been, like he predates all of us normal humans, even though we know literally that's not true. This idea that he's almost immortal, that he's ancient, that he's kind of beyond what we can fully wrap our heads around. I think that those are all big, pieces of that here. And the idea that he could cradle dinosaurs in his hands. Again, it's this huge exaggeration of his size. Because he was an enormous man, and I know dinosaurs come in all sizes, so maybe a baby raptor or something he could have cradled in his hand, but for the most part, we recognize that that's sort of an absurdist way of looking at it. Okay, I want to jump over to page 171 to number 75 here. Andre the Giant scaled the Empire State Building with Marilyn Monroe on one hand, Cleopatra in the other. They marveled at how small we are. So for this one, there's some parallelism here. I think most of you would still know that this pop culture reference to King Kong, right? Even if you haven't actually seen, any of those movies. Nonetheless, this idea of, the monstrous, I think he's technically a gorilla, but scaling the Empire State Building, we're putting Andre the Giant in that class, right? And then Marilyn Monroe and Cleopatra. Another signal that we're not supposed to take this literally at all, right? Because they didn't exist anywhere near the same time period. So we know that we're playing with kind of other almost mythical figures here, right? Because Marilyn Monroe, again, you may have never seen a Marilyn Monroe movie, but I'm guessing most of you know that name at least and have some sense of who she is. Is kind of an icon of her time. And similarly, Cleopatra, predates all of us by, quite some time, but nonetheless, is a historical figure that kind of survives all that. And that last line there, they marveled at how small we are. I really like that line because of the different ways we can read into that. One being the sense of, it's talking about them, like Marilyn Monroe, Cleopatra, and the rest of us. We're all typical human beings. We're all so small, especially relative to Andre the Giant or relative to the bigger things in life. Another way of reading it, though, is they're climbing up a building and looking down. They could be looking down at all the people, and we are the people they're looking down at, and we're so small relative to these huge mythical figures who are climbing with Andre the Giant. So I think there's sort of some fun wordplay there in different ways we could interpret that. The last one I want to go to is number 116, and this is on the very next page there. Andre the Giant drank 3 bottles of whiskey and grappled with the devil in a bingo hall in Memphis. Then he invented the blues. So this part what I like about it is, of all of them, in some ways, it feels sort of the most conceivably true, except for maybe the last part there. But this is where we get into what I would describe as secular myth, right? So we have myths where, it's Andre the Giant and hanging out with dragons, and sort of being this, literally larger than life figure who predates time and all this stuff. By contrast, the idea that he could drink a lot. Right? Anyone who wants to look up Andre the Giant, if you Google how much could Andre the Giant drink or questions like that, you'll find tons of answers. There was a documentary HBO did about him not so long ago where they spent a whole segment of it talking about his drinking exploits. So the concept of him drinking 3 bottles of whiskey, while that seems ridiculous, not entirely ridiculous for this human being. Grappled with the devil, obviously the devil being a more mythical figure, but wrestling takes on all kinds of characters, right? Maybe he would have wrestled a character portraying the devil in a bingo hall. That's kind of a setting for a small-scale wrestling show in Memphis, and then he invented the blues. And to me, the most unbelievable part of that is the idea that he would invent the whole genre of blues music. But I think we can read that a little bit more metaphorically. But anyway, I think it's really interesting how we combine, again, at this point, the more secular myths, the more kind of realist stuff that's sort of more just exaggeration or cherry picking specific details that are wild, as opposed to kind of whole swath, sort of making things up. So I'm going to leave that there. There's obviously more we could talk about both the Schumacher and the Kaneko, but I want to, just kind of segue from that into some broader questions. I think these pieces are sort of fun to read, so I hope some of you felt the same way. But I want to lead to this question of why people watch professional wrestling, right? I already established that I understand it's not sort of real competition in sort of a traditional sense, but it's a form of entertainment, a form of storytelling, is the way that I look at it. And to be transparent, I'm a fan. I enjoy the form. It's something that ran in my family. My grandfather was a Chinese immigrant, and he came to the States, never really learned English, but professional wrestling was one of the few stories he could follow because it was very straightforward. He could follow who was the good guy, who was the bad guy, based on who was cheating or who wasn't, or who the rest of the crowd was cheering for or who they weren't, and kind of fill in the blanks from there of just understanding this staged fight in front of him. There's a degree of escapism there, right? Of kind of, we leave kind of the world we know behind in favor of these kind of, violent stories, but they're kind of absurd and sort of imagining, what it would be like to be in that position or have a body that large. There's a degree of athletic exhibition. That's something that, for anyone who has watched it more recently, who's an active fan now, or at least was in your youth, a lot of just kind of, flying around the ring, doing things really quickly, flying through the air, doing flips. These people are athletes, right? Or at least a large number of them are. And deceptively, there's some complex psychology there, right? Because I would suggest, for the most part, fans understand this isn't really real at this point, right? This isn't, they're actual fights. And yet they will fill up arenas to cheer for these people, right? In a pre-pandemic and hopefully a post-pandemic era. So we're going to go and we're going to cheer for people, even though we know it's not affecting anything because it's not actually a real fight, right? There's some pretty complex psychology to that, I think, and I could talk about this all day. I'm going to leave it there, just as a kind of a broader point to meditate on, discuss a little bit for those who are interested. But okay, to segue into the last part of this video, this will probably be the last video lecture I'm going to record for a couple weeks now, unless I feel a need to make big announcements or kind of correct course on something or give a big update if one comes up. But otherwise, we're going to be focusing for the next 6 classes on the workshop of your initial research integration assignments. So just to review the workflow, you all have a due date, you all have a workshop date at this point. So by 11 a.m. on your workshop date, please make sure you have uploaded your essay. At that point, I will then be saving the files, and then I'm going to make them available to the rest of the class so they can read them for the next time. That's going to be their homework reading for the next time, and then the subject of our class discussion. And because we're going to be so centered on discussion, that's where I'm going to kind of fade to the background to an extent. I'll be in the discussion, but I won't be kind of trying to be the dominant voice the way I would be for a video lecture. So when you're writing these initial initial research integration assignments, there is a spectrum of what you can do. It can be as simple as sort of taking your initial artifact analysis, polishing it, kind of responding to the feedback I gave you earlier, and then starting to weave in elements of your research that you think are kind of speak to the artifact most, or that bring up an interesting aspect of it. So you can kind of at the base level just sort of combine these things and start to refine how they would go together as an essay. If you want to push further and simply get ahead a little bit, you can treat this as a rough draft for the researched argument essay. That's the bigger, more heavily weighted assignment coming up. All things being equal, I encourage you to do that because it's going to be coming up. As I've said, if you turn in your initial research integration for workshop on time and reasonably in line with the expectations I gave you on the assignment prompt, you're going to get an A-level score, at least a 9 out of 10. And so, take this time when it's relatively low stakes to try it out, to see what you can get out of an essay. You'll get my feedback, you'll get the class's feedback, and you'll be able to apply that for the next round and hopefully have a really polished paper when you do the final go round. But you can choose where on that spectrum you want to fall, especially people who are going early. I certainly understand if you want to take the kind of the less developed route just so you have less time to put these pieces together. People going later in the workshop process, I all the more strongly encourage you to treat this as a rough draft for your research argument essay, just because at that point you're not going to have as much time to turn around and write a new essay after that. So in general, it'll work that the essays are going to be due for a class period. I will post that class, and then we'll read them for next time, and we'll talk about the ones we had from the previous class in that class discussion. And if that sounds a little bit convoluted, rest assured, again, I think this is pretty clear once we start doing it. But for the first cluster, again, it's a slightly different setup. That first cluster of readings is due on this Friday. Again, the reason for that is I only announced the schedule on Monday. I didn't feel like it was fair to say you have to turn around and give me your whole assignment 2 days later. Even 4 days, it's a quick turnaround time, but those folks did volunteer to go earlier, so I hope that they're feeling well equipped to have something ready for Friday. So on Friday, I am planning to post a special extra class discussion where you don't have to participate in the discussion itself. It's more just for me to share the student work that you have to read over the weekend to discuss it for Monday's class. And after that point, it works like a normal class. So you have to leave at least one big substantive comment per class session. So if you want to comment on only one of the essays, that's okay. That is the standard that we've set for participation guidelines. But I do encourage everyone to read everyone else's work and ideally to comment on everyone's work, right? Because this is the point in the class where really the degree of effort you put in, the degree of comments you leave is only helping your classmates. And in turn, I hope they will do that for you. So the other thing I'll say is if you notice that one of the essays has a ton of comments and another one only has 1 or 2 comments, I encourage you to make sure you're paying attention to the one that doesn't have as much feedback. Help each other out. Again, because if one person gets comments from the whole class, has 14 sets of comments to work with, and another person only has 1 or 2, this is not really fair at that point, right? So if we have a more even distribution where most people are commenting on most of the essays and everyone has at least 6 or 7 or 8 comments to go with, that's kind of the best case scenario for this sort of thing. I understand that you're all busy. You might not be able to comment on every essay every time. That's exceeding expectations. But I will say, especially for those of you who are worried about your participation grade, especially if you've missed a few classes, this is a really good opportunity to make up some ground. If you are someone who's consistently giving really good feedback on all of the readings, I will definitely take that into account. I might even be so inclined to erase one of your previous absences if that's the case. So in any event, just take that under consideration there. When we're having these discussions, positive feedback is important, right? Because part of this whole process is about seeing how other people do it. If you're not feeling very confident in your own writing at this point, seeing how other people are writing these essays, seeing what you can borrow as ideas for how you can approach it yourself. That's part of why we do this. So giving them kind of that feedback and pointing out to the whole class, and also just to encourage each other, right? I think a lot of people, at least, I don't say most, but a lot of people are sort of intimidated by the writing process. Maybe at some point in their schooling they were told they weren't a very good writer. You're more of a math person. You're not really an English person. Don't get defeated by that, right? This is a great opportunity for us to build each other up, build our confidence a little bit by showing how much we actually do know, how good we actually are at these things. But also don't shy away from constructive criticism. Let's be honest with each other. If everyone just says, wow, this essay is great, and I'm the only one giving constructive criticism, that doesn't necessarily help the student, right? Because they're going to have to turn this essay later on, and if they only have my feedback to work from, that means they got shortchanged all that other feedback, right? And I don't know about you, but for me, I would much rather get a bunch of feedback that's potentially critical, that points out things I could do better in this assignment where I'm guaranteed an A, than find out later on the assignment that has more points attached to it that actually it's only a B or C level essay, right? So being honest with each other, giving each other helpful feedback, but also being respectful of each other, right? Because I think you all can kind of recognize this, but when someone's just kind of attacking or sort of rude about the feedback they're giving you, you're less prone to listen, right? It's less fun, it's less interesting at that point. But when someone can point out the positive, be respectful when they point out this could be even better if you did this, or you should probably expand, and this is where I'd love to see more of this essay. That's really useful feedback to get from your peers. But after you've been through the workshop process, the next key step is applying it to your research argument essay. For those folks who are going really early in this process, you're going to have a good 4 weeks or so to be able to really craft this thing. That's a long time to write an essay, right? And I encourage you just to go ahead and get started while it's fresh in your head. Take the feedback, get started. Spend the next week kind of collecting notes and doing some revisions, and then you've got extra weeks if you want to find more research sources, or if you want to just go carefully proofread. If you want to take this opportunity to use the Writing Center, which most of you still need to do. I've only gotten one confirmation so far of someone who's visited the Writing Center, and thank you to the student who did that. But take advantage of these opportunities to really put forth a strong essay at this point. For those going on the later end, again, the pressure is on I'm still going to grade it the same way, but to put more work into this initial research integration, because you're only going to have a week and a half to 2 weeks to be able to whip your research argument essay into shape, which is a good amount of time, but not the same wealth of time people going earlier in the process get. So basically I'm saying, don't wait on it. Once you've been workshopped, collect that feedback from others, read the feedback I gave you, and start working on your research argument essay and seeing what you can do with that. But okay, that's all I've got for today. This is a little bit long video lecture, but again, it's my last one for a few weeks if everything goes as planned. So thank you for watching. Please feel free to weigh in with questions, comments, ideas in the discussion board below. I'll leave probably just 2 threads. I'll probably tie together the Schumacher and the Kaneko readings, but then I'll have a thread for discussing this whole workshop process, the initial research integration, and so on and so forth as well. But thanks everyone. It'll be a little while before you see a video from me, but I'll look forward to engaging with you on the discussion board in the interim.